It was a photograph no bigger than the palm of a hand, black and white, grainy, and yet unspeakably loud. It did not shout, it did not scream, but it echoed through the chambers of history, through the bones of those who saw it, through the silence it left behind. The moment it appeared on television screens and newspaper front pages, the world fell into a hush, as if the earth itself held its breath. The picture was taken by a 24-year-old war photographer named Elias Granger, embedded with the medical unit during the final weeks of a long conflict in a remote region no textbook would ever mention. He didn't intend to take the photo. He hadn't even realized his shutter clicked. It was instinct, reflex, survival. But that one frame captured as the sun was bleeding into dusk, as ash floated like snow over a ruined village, would become one of the most haunting testaments to war's true cause. In it, a little girl stood barefoot on broken stone, her face not turned toward the camera but toward something beyond it. Her home still smoldering, her brother lying still in the foreground, his hand outstretched toward her but forever. Frozen in time, her eyes, wide and hollow, did not hold tears. They held something worse, as though she had known too much sorrow to cry anymore. Elias didn't sleep for 3 nights after taking that photograph. He couldn't. The image had imprinted itself on the back of his eyelids. He stared at it for hours, wondering whether he had captured something beautiful or something vile, whether this image would heal or harm, and most importantly, whether the world deserved to see it. But he sent it, because silence, too, can be a weapon. The photograph spread like wildfire, first among journalists, then in political offices, then on university campuses, and finally into the living rooms of families thousands of miles away, who had never known the girl's name but now couldn't forget her face. Protests ignited. Ceasefires were demanded. Children began asking their parents questions they couldn't answer. And governments, for once, were forced to listen. But who was she? No one knew. The records had burned with the village, the names of the dead, swallowed by smoke. And yet, the photo refused to die. It lived on magazine covers, in museum exhibits, in textbooks and documentaries. It became the image not of a single war, but of all wars, not of one child, but every child. And as the years passed, something peculiar happened. People began to forget. Not the photo, no, that stayed, but the why, the wait, the reason we had once promised never to let this happen again. New wars began. New victims emerged, but the girl in the photo, she remained there, still barefoot, still alone, still unseen, until now. Because this story isn't just about a photograph, it's about what happens after, what we do with the silence that follows, and what we risk if we let that silence return. My name is Mira Lantin, and for the past 9 years, I have searched for the truth behind that image. I began with a rumor, a whisper in a refugee camp about a girl who survived, but never spoke again. I followed cold trails through destroyed archive, questioned elders with trembling hands, tracked the stories of those who remembered someone like her, even if her name had vanished like a breath in the wind. And finally, I found her, not in a war zone, not in a grave, but in a small coastal town, where the sky met the sea in a quiet, broken kind of peace. She was no longer a girl. She was a woman now. Her, Amara. She was alive, but her silence had never ended. Amara lived in a house with no mirrors. The first thing I noticed when she let me in was the absence of reflections. No polished surfaces. No glass panes unmarred by dust. No frame capturing her now woman face. Not even in passing. It was as though she had made a pact with herself never to see who she had become, or perhaps never to meet the eyes of the girl she once was. She spoke little. In fact, for the first 5 days I stayed in that small town, she said nothing at all. Her neighbors referred to her kindly but distantly. She's good with children, one whispered. Tends the garden, said another. Lost so on, long ago. But none of them knew the photo. None of them had ever connected the scar across her left brow, the solemn calm of her stare, to the image that had once shaken governments and saved lives. Because time is merciless, and peace, when it comes, is often wrapped in the silence of those who paid the highest price for it. It wasn't until the 6th morning that she placed something on the table before me. A faded newspaper clipping, its edges curled like old petals. The photograph. The photograph. Her finger rested lightly on the figure of the small boy, her brother. I would learn later. His name was Malik. He had been 6. She had been 9. She didn't look at me, but I knew what she was asking. Why now? I breathed slowly, my voice trembling, unsure if it was out of reverence or guilt. Because people are starting to forget, I said. And we can't let them. That was the moment something broke. Not loudly, not violently, but like the subtle shift in a glacier before it crumbles. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes still impossibly large, impossibly tired, closed for a moment that lasted a lifetime. And when she opened them, she finally spoke. I didn't want to be remembered for that moment. Silence. I didn't want him to be remembered like that. Her voice was soft, like the wind between seagrass. I sat still, afraid even my breathing might scare her silence back into place. She continued. He was singing just before the bombs fell, a silly song about clouds shaped like animals. He wanted to become a pilot, not to drop bombs, but to fly so high he could teach the sky how to cry for us. She paused, her hands clenched slowly, like she was wringing the memory dry. That moment in the photograph, that wasn't who we were. That was who we were reduced to. Her words struck like thunder inside me, because she was right. The photograph had frozen a tragedy, but in doing so, it had erased a life. A boy who sang, a girl who laughed, a family that once knew birthdays and lullabies. The world had turned them into symbols when all they had wanted was to remain human. So I asked her, gently, carefully, what would you want the world to know now? She looked at me, not through me, not past me, but at me, and said that the silence after war is sometimes worse than the war itself. Because it feels like no one remembers, like the pain was only loud enough for a headline, but never for healing. It was then that I knew this story wasn't just about the photograph. It was about what came after, the lives not lost, but left behind, the quiet survivors, and perhaps the most haunting truth. Amara had not wanted to be found, not for fame, not for glory, but because being found meant reliving everything she had spent a lifetime trying to forget. And yet, she let me stay, because somewhere, buried beneath the rubble of her heart, was still a belief that stories when told truthfully can stop new wars from starting. Amara began to speak to me in fragments, not full conversations, just pieces. A sentence while watering the basil in her window box, a few words while folding the laundry with quiet grace. Small things, everyday things, but each one carried the weight of something much larger beneath. Like the way she paused when she saw a child with a balloon, or how she flinched ever so slightly when thunder rolled over the sea. Her silence wasn't empty, it was full of ghosts she hadn't buried, memories she hadn't dared to name. One evening, I found her sitting on the beach. The sun was setting, and for a moment the sky looked like fire, but this fire didn't destroy, it glowed. She motioned for me to sit beside her, and that's when she finally told me everything. I remember the way Malik smelled, she whispered, like soap and dust and something sweet. He used to collect pebbles and pretend they were soldiers, building forts in the sand. The morning before it happened, he told me he was going to give Mama a flower made of paper. He had folded it himself. I never got to see if he gave it to her. She exhaled, her voice breaking like a wave on rock. I saw him die. No tremble, no theatrics, just truth, raw and surgical. I remember the sound before the explosion. It was like the sky had forgotten how to breathe. And then, the world turned white. Not black, white, like the light at the end of something. I woke up to screaming, and then silence. So much silence. My ears were ringing, but inside, it was stiller than death. I saw him reach for me, and I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was see. That's what the photograph caught. She paused, pulling her knees to her chest. Elias didn't know. He didn't mean to take that moment. But maybe it's good that he did. Because that scream I couldn't let out, it made it to the world. It traveled. It shook things. She turned to me. But then they stopped shaking. I felt a heat rise in my chest. Not anger, not guilt, something worse. A quiet kind of shame. Because she was right. We, the world, had let it happen again. Over and over. Different countries, different names, same screams. She stood up, brushed the sand from her legs, and began walking back toward the house. And I stayed there, long after she had gone, listening to the sea speak the language of memory. Weeks passed, and one night, Amara left an envelope on my bedside table. Inside were old letters, some addressed, some unfinished, written in shaky child's handwriting. They were from Malik, notes he had hidden beneath her bed, little stories and secrets he hadn't dared say aloud. One read, "If I ever die, don't cry too much. Just plant a tree and name it after me. That way, I'll still get to grow." I read that line again and again. That night, Amara and I planted a tree, a small sapling near the cliffs where the wind sang. We named it Malik. We didn't speak. We didn't need to, because something was changing. Her silence was no longer a prison, it was becoming a garden. And it was then that she asked the question that would shape everything that followed. Will you tell them? I didn't need to ask who them was. The world that had once listened. The world that had forgotten. The world that might, just might, listen again. I returned home with more than notes, more than recordings or photos. I returned with a burden, a sacred one, to carry her voice into places where silence had grown too comfortable, where war had become numbers, where pain had become footage, where memory had been traded for convenience. And so I began. I stood before classrooms filled with students too young to have known the war, but old enough to inherit its consequences. I showed them the photograph. At first, they reacted the way the world always had shocked, disturbed, silent. But then I told them Amara's name, Malik's paper flower, the pebbles he collected, the sound the sky made before the explosion, and something changed. The image wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was real, living, breathing, hurting. I spoke at conferences, at vigils, at memorials. I wrote articles, produced documentaries, spoke into microphones that trembled in my hands. Every word a bridge between the living and the forgotten. I watched as old men wept, as veterans gripped their medals with guilt, as mothers clutched their children just a little tighter. But the most powerful moment came in a gallery in Oslo. The photograph was part of a traveling exhibit titled Wounds That Time Could Not Heal. It hung in the center of a cold, dimly lit room. Beneath it, we placed a plaque no longer anonymous. Amara and Malik, survivors of a forgotten war, victims of a remembered silence. This is not just a photograph, it is a promise. People came, thousands, not to just look but to feel. They left messages on post-it notes. Some wrote apologies, some left prayers. Others drew paper flowers and folded them into Malik's shape. But still, not enough, because war was not over. It had simply changed its name, its borders, its currency. The faces were new, but the stories were not. And every time a new conflict erupted, a new photograph emerged, a new child, a new scream, and the silence came creeping back. So I returned to Amara one final time. She was older, her hair silver at the edges, but her eyes still the same, that storm-wrapped calm. I told her everything, the gallery, the messages, the students, the paper flowers. She smiled. For the first time, I saw her smile. And then she said something I will never forget. Then perhaps the photograph did not steal his voice. He carried it. We stood beneath the tree. We had planted Malik's tree. It was taller now, its leaves reaching wide to catch the sun. The wind moved through its branches like a lullaby. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small stone, one of Malik's. She placed it at the tree space and whispered, "He was never meant to be remembered for his death, but for how deeply he lived, even in such a short time." I left that town with no plans to return, because I understood now Amara didn't need the world to find her anymore. She needed the world to remember why it had. And that is why I tell you this story. Not for pity, not for shock, but for memory. Because when we forget, we do not simply dishonor the past, we invite it back. And that photograph, grainy, black and white, still as death is. Not just an image, a mirror, a question. Will we look away again, or will we finally listen? So I ask you now, look at her. Really, look. Not as a symbol, not as a tragedy, but as a person, a sister, a survivor, a story that could have been yours. And remember, the silence that follows war is a choice, and so is breaking.